Go ahead, John. Tell us what's going on in Canada.
Well, let me say that I would really emphasize this right to remain silent. It's the most important thing in my view. And you know, they always, as others have said, say you'll have this is your opportunity to talk and so on. You'll have lots of opportunity to talk later if you want to, if your lawyer advises you to. And if you've had that 5-second or 5-minute conversation with a lawyer because they've given you access to counsel, then it's even more important that you follow the lawyer's advice, because if you don't, and you talk to them, then they'll say, well, you had legal advice and you chose to speak to us after you had legal advice that told you not to. So you make it very hard for us to exclude the evidence. Like most of the cases we win is because the police violate your rights. So sometimes you don't want to exercise them too vigorously. You want to sort of step back and let them violate your rights so that we have some basis then to exclude the evidence and win the case. But anyway, so I thought what I'd quickly talk about, I should say this. Of course, if you're coming to Canada, it's still illegal. You don't have the right to remain silent at the border if you're trying to get in. On the other hand, if they detain you and are then investigating you, then you probably should exercise that right to remain silent. You're probably going to get deported back, but better than plowing ahead if there's any risk of being busted. Our borders are as bad as yours in terms of letting people in who've got a history of cannabis. I'm about to do a paper on the consequences of non-conviction. When they start a case against you and they drop the charges, we still have trouble getting into the U.S. if there's a stay of proceedings on your record or a withdrawal. So there's that gray area in between where you're still prejudiced even though you've never been convicted. And don't go to prison. If you go to prison, they'll treat a stay of proceedings as a conviction, as a factor that'll count against you in terms of risk to reoffend. Anyway, my perspective after 40 years of practice is that it all comes down to the legal approach to the particular situation. And when you have something for which there is a demand, the prohibition approach is absolutely stupid. And the only other approach is to regulate and tax. The best example is so stupid is recently they banned tobacco in our federal prisons. Now, tobacco is the drug that I don't think the criminal law has ever been used to stop people from smoking or using tobacco, at least not in my country. Education has worked very well at reducing the number of people that smoke tobacco. And so we haven't had to use the criminal law, but in the government's wisdom, they banned it in the prison. Now, what do you think happened? Well, a cigarette used to cost $1. It went up to $10 for one cigarette. A bail, a big bartering thing in the prisons, went from $30 to $300. People now get shipped to maximum security and get put in the hole for being involved in the tobacco trade. People get stabbed over tobacco as the price goes up. The guards used to go in on the morning shift and leave after the end of their shift, now have to go in 20 times a day because they too smoke tobacco, but they have to go out to the parking lot to do it. It also gives them 20 opportunities to bring the stuff in for their fellow addict that they're sympathetic towards. You know, so tempting the staff to once again make a little extra money, in fact quite a bit of extra money, because tobacco is still the #1 drug. So it doesn't matter whether it's a good drug, a bad drug. Prohibition as an approach pushes the price up, takes away people's peaceful remedies to resolve disputes, and leads to violence. And that's inevitable if you take a prohibitionist approach. And so we have to somehow educate governments, especially if you think back to history. You know, we had people lined up around the block to see their doctors to get a chit so they could get alcohol. Now it's lining up to get a chit so that you can get cannabis. So history is hopefully repeating himself. And when you have a downturn in the economy like this, it's a good opportunity to try and focus on how the legalization of cannabis, regulating and taxing it, would do wonders for the economy, and did wonders for the economy when we decided to regulate booze. And, you know, history should repeat itself at this time while we're having these particular problems. And, of course, the focus is on the cost of prosecution, the cost of people putting people in jail, these sorts of things. Can we afford to do it? You know, with our mandatory minimums, that are planned, we're going to have another huge increase in the number of people going to prison over the growing of cannabis or these sorts of things. Totally and absolutely idiotic waste of the taxpayers' dollars. So I don't know how much time I have left. Just a quick point about, we went to the Supreme Court of Canada to try and say that the prohibition against the personal use of cannabis was unconstitutional in Canada. We said it affects, the offense affects people's lives, liberty in particular, because it's an offense for which you can go to have your liberty deprived, and something called the security of your person. And in Canada, they can't take these things away or reduce them except in accordance with something called the principles of fundamental justice. And the one that we focused on is something called gross disproportionality. So if they pass a law that's designed to prevent harm, as they say most of the prohibitionist laws are intended, but those laws actually cause harm, then you're achieving a grossly disproportionate effect on the law's unconstitutional. Well, in relation to cannabis, they said, hey, Conroy, these pot smokers, they're not addicted. They're civilly disobedient. They bring the consequences of the criminal justice system onto themselves by their civil disobedience. You know, they make that choice. So that's why we've gone back to the Supreme Court of Canada on behalf of the supervised injection site. These are people who are severely addicted to heroin, cocaine, injection drug use, cocaine, that sort of thing. Many of them have mental health issues, and they've developed addictions as well. And the real deep end, if you like, of the system in terms of drug use. And we've been able to show at trial and on appeal, and we're now waiting a decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, we argued it in May, that, you know, when an addict goes into a dark alley to shoot up, first having spent a lot of time trying to get the money to be able to buy the drug, he goes into that alley, shoots up quickly, misses his vein, gets abscesses, doesn't get primary medical care, shares needles with other people, all worrying about the policeman, looking over their shoulder, worrying about the policeman. That's why they're in the dark alley. And then the policeman's not going to bust you anymore. They're going to take your drugs. That's the worst possible thing that could happen after all that hard work to try and get those drugs. So, and then they go off and have sex with other people, and we have a public health epidemic of hepatitis A, B, C, HIV, AIDS, all these sorts of things. The downtown east side of Vancouver, that's what has been happening. So we've been able to establish to the satisfaction of a court at the trial level that the enforcement of this law in relation to addicted persons, and an addicted person by definition includes the definition of addiction, at least that was accepted at our court, includes a person is craving to try and get more of that drug and then has poor choice and control over their decisions. And so the court accepted that it's the law that causes disproportionate harm when you try to enforce it against people who are sick, who need health care, not criminal law, and not being put in jail. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for the good work. I feel like I could use a little bit more cannabis. I think I might have a little bit of an addiction. So I think, no, it's interesting to see our courts tell us that there's no pattern of addiction. It reminds me that with cannabis, with no significant physical harm, no significant, except outside of about 10% of the population, risk of addiction, the banning of cannabis is similar to the banning of psychedelics, and is similar to book burning. People who burn books don't burn books because they don't like covers and pages and the words inside them. They burn books because they don't like the ideas that they produce or contain. When we're talking about the banning of cannabis, the banning of psychedelic drugs that have no physical impact, negative physical impact on the self, we're talking about the banning of thoughts and ideas, and that's where we're talking about unconstitutionality.